Coming Back is a listener-supported podcast. To support the show and receive weekly grief guidance from me, monthly group grief support calls, and the first look at upcoming books and projects, become a patron now at patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. Just $3 a month gets you access to everything there is to see on Patreon, plus connection to a beautiful group of grievers just like you. Unlock grief support now for $3 a month and support this show at patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. Thank you so much this week to AB for your support. What if you could improve your relationship to grief a little bit every day? If you're looking for comforting words and practical exercises condensed into one small paragraph each day, check out my new book, Your Grief, Your Way. It's a non-religious daily devotional that helps you get in touch with your heart and your grief for a full 366 days. Find Your Grief, Your Way now on Amazon, Audible, IndieBound, Barnes & Noble, or anywhere else you buy books. And stay tuned to the end of this episode for a special excerpt from Your Grief, Your Way. Hi there, and welcome to Coming Back, a podcast about coming back to life after death, divorce, diagnosis, and more. Today, I'm talking to social worker Cristina Chipriano of Bo's Place in Houston, Texas, about the importance of offering grief support in Spanish. We're talking about how death can bring families closer together, how the cultural value of family pride can help Latinos grieve, and why it's so important to express grief in a first language, or the language of the heart. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who speaks, writes, and teaches powerful truths on grief and loss. My mom's death in 2013 set me on the path to becoming a lifelong student of grief, and I use what I learned to create a world where grief is welcomed, normalized, and even embraced. Because even through grief, we are growing. Let's get started. Hi there, grief growers. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Coming Back. I am jumping around. I'm on the edge of my seat because in less than 1 week, my new book, Your Grief, Your Way, will be live and in the world September 29th. Tuesday is the day. There is still time to pre-order the book and join the launch team on Facebook if that's something that resonates with you. Members of the launch team get access to not only a free digital copy of the book, an advanced review copy, they, in exchange for writing a review on Amazon.com, also receive access to an exclusive book launch party with me, and this is happening on launch day, September 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific. So if you would like a free digital copy of Your Grief, Your Way in exchange for writing a review and helping me get the word out about the book, as well as admission to this exclusive launch party on September 29th, I would still so love to have you. You can search the Your Grief, Your Way launch team on Facebook, and you can find a link to that in the show notes. This week, I also announced 5 new 90-minute Zoom workshops for grief surrounding specific topics that you all have been bringing me for months, if not years now. You can see all of them on my website under the Events tab, but the 2 that I want to share with you today are the ones coming up this Friday and Saturday, September 25th and 26th. The first workshop is one called Release the Pain of Guilt, which is all about processing guilt and allowing ourselves to be released from the physical, mental, emotional, even spiritual grip of guilt after loss. It's something that's very haunting. And so how do we turn around and talk to that ghost and say, hey, I appreciate you, but my space is off limits to you now. So kind of more or less setting boundaries with guilt, but very much in these workshops, they're not structured. They're not a PowerPoint presentation. You won't be bored with slides. It's literally an opportunity for me to see your face, hear your voice, hear your grief story in your own words, and bring what you're struggling with to the table where I can work it out with you in real time. So it's very much guidance in real life as it's happening. Yes. The second workshop that's happening is Saturday morning, September 26th. It's called Sit and Stay in Painful Emotions. This is more about learning to physically and emotionally tolerate really hard emotions and grief, like anxiety, sadness, despair, numbness. And these are things that so many grievers come to me with. They're like, I don't know how to hold this in my body. I don't know how to contain this without feeling as if I am going to die. And so really, the focus of that workshop is going to be, how do we hold or become a container, not only that's big enough for these emotions, but perhaps one that's deep enough also. And again, this is one where you're showing up in the space and sharing your grief story with me. So while the topic is sit and stay in painful emotions, what that looks like and exactly how to sit and stay there will be very unique to you. And I can help you do that through this workshop. If either one of these resonates with you, or if you'd like to see the whole lineup of 90-minute workshops, and there are more to come, grief growers, you can visit the link in the show notes for this episode, or go to shelbyforsythia.com/events. And lastly, before we get to the interview today, I want to remind everyone living in the United States to register to vote. Yesterday was National Voter Registration Day, and or check your voter registration, especially if you've recently moved. The presidential election coming up in November is direly important, to say the least, and our hearts and our futures and our griefs are in the hands of whoever wins. And trust me, I would love to be a person who says that I don't care who you vote for. I would love it if both of our presidential candidates were that good. But unfortunately, time and experience have shown us that they are not, and that is not a reality. So I hope you will join me in unenthusiastically casting a vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris this fall. And please, grief growers, if you can vote by mail, do it. The coronavirus pandemic is continuing, heartbreakingly, to kill hundreds each week, and anything that we can do to stay safe and stay home while we exercise our right to vote is vital. And if you're opting out of voting this year, if you're saying politics are just not for me, I am so sick and tired of the rigmarole, I hear you, and I urge you to reconsider. If grief is something you give a crap about, please vote. There is grief deeply embedded in politics. There has been for years and years and years and years and years. And there are politics deeply embedded in the experience of grief. So cast a vote for president and research your local elections as well. Your water, your schools, your parks, and your communities are deeply impacted by who you choose to represent you on a ballot. You can check your voter registration and register to vote at vote.org, and you can find a link to that website in the show notes. And now, my conversation with Cristina Cipriano. I am really delighted and stoked even to introduce you to Cristina Cipriano, who came to us through the avenue of Lindsay Whistle-Fenton, who we interviewed last season for Speaking Grief, the documentary on how to talk to people, friends and family, and even perfect strangers about grief. And Christina's work is really vital in that she runs kind of a division of a grief center called Bo's Place in Texas for Spanish programming. And this struck me because in grief, especially in America and the westernized world, I think we think of grief support as only in English, but when we can put grief support into a language that we know, or a first language or a primary language, we get to take our brains out of the equation of trying to translate what we're feeling and just say what's on our heart. So Cristina, welcome to the show. And if you could start us off with your loss story or your experience with grief as you know it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually, in my life experience, the death of a number of close family members, starting at the age of 7. My cousin died while he was 5 years old, and we were very close to one another. It was a very traumatic death. My first encounter with death itself. Following that, about 4 months later, my aunt and godmother died. So very subsequent loss and death, all before second grade. So it was quite a pivotal time in my life, and I've been able to, through the support of my family, but also I think relying on mentors throughout my life, being able to process both of those deaths. But really what has been monumental in that regard is how many times throughout my life I've continued to go back to that year, and those couple of months, and how time stands still. Even now, I think we're at maybe 26 years later, just about. And on both of their death anniversaries, it feels as though time stands still, like nothing else really matters on those days. And it continues to tie me to this work too, to know that time, there's a saying, time heals all wounds, but in some regards, you grieve to the extent that you loved. And as a 7-year-old, it can tell you at this point, it was some deep love, because I can still feel it. There's still days, specifically on their death anniversaries and big milestones, that I go back to that time and wonder what their life would be, and still what would my life be with them.
Yeah, and I think that never ends. And I'm glad that you spoke to that, because there is this sense that time stands still when our loved ones still aren't here. Because, we continue to mark time going forward. Like, what other choice do we have but to continue to live after somebody we love dies, and these dates come up, or these moments come up, or these milestones come up, and we're like, it's like somebody hits that sound on the record player, and it's like time is standing still once again. And I like this thing that you spoke to too about the year that changed your life. And I think this is common for so many grievers, is there was a span of 6 months, a year. For me, it was 4 years of just like loss, 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 loss. And it's still the thing that, like, almost butterfly effect. It's like, if this hadn't happened, my life would have taken a totally different direction. And I wonder how you continue to honor that as you get older, of like, if this hadn't happened, my life wouldn't look like it does right now. I wonder if there's resentment there, or even a kind of gratitude, or a mix of both.
I think more than anything, it showed me what resiliency looks like. It showed me what my own capacity for love is, and it has shown me really what I think adversity brings forth in someone. And so I think in that regard, it has brought me to the work that I do now. And I firmly believe that it's the reason why I'm so passionate about working with our Spanish-speaking families, and not just because my own family speaks Spanish and it's my first language, but because I know firsthand what that looks like, and at least for my family and our own experience. And I wonder, what would our lives have been like had there been a Beau's Place that offered Spanish language groups in 1996 in Houston, as opposed to relying on our family, which we did, but each one of us was grieving. There wasn't a part of our family that wasn't, and what that meant for us. And so I think, if anything, it's more so, it is the fuel of my fire for the work that I do. It's seeing my cousins walk their grief journey of experiencing the death of a sibling and a mother. And they are primarily the reason why I do this work, because I've seen what happens when you don't get the support that you need, and trying to help navigate and at the same time eradicate solo grievers in that regard. So I'll say it, not that I'm grateful that they died, but more so the experiences and the lessons learned, and what I learned about myself, and the fire that it fuels, the passion for the work that I do, is all encompassing. And so it's really hard to imagine my life without the singular event, or these months, to the same extent, right? Because life would look completely different. And I sit back, and I guess now, as you're talking, I wonder, would I even be in the mental health field? Would I be an accountant and doing, not to say anything about the accountants, we're just really different worlds. And so I guess in that regard, just, how different my life would be. Would I be this, I doubt I would be this in tune with grief in and of itself.
Yeah. And I think that's really appropriate to say. And in some ways, it's like I would have known myself as a different person too, if I had not experienced grief. My self perception of who I am and how I show up in the world and the relationships that I form, the languages that I speak, and all the other things that are associated would have come to me differently as well. If you had been an accountant, if I had been an ad executive, like all these kind of like alternative parallel universes that we could have gone down. And so there's not necessarily a gratitude for grief, but our ability to imagine any other way. Yeah, it's hard to do. I definitely want to get into this kind of how you got where you are and what you craved or wanted in 1996. Because I heard this phrase once, or maybe there was a diagram in a book that I read where it's like when grieving people are looking to support, one of the best things they can do for themselves is lean out to community resources, to things in the neighborhood that are helpful, and sometimes to lean in on family, friends, depending on the person that you lost who's grieving. It's almost like we're all trying to stand on like one-legged stools, like we've all lost some kind of appendage. And so there's not necessarily toxicity involved, but it's like we're all trying to mend ourselves by leaning on things that are also broken. And so it's how do we lean out into systems that can support us and trust fall like back into these things that we know have a little bit more structure or sturdiness about them when we ourselves feel very broken. And so to have something like that to lean out on is really powerful.
It is. And I will credit quite a bit. I remember in second grade, my cousin's death was highly publicized, like it was all over the media. And I remember in that, just as I know now that kids do, and you just randomly tell people at the grocery store and whatnot, I remember telling my teacher and saying, you know, like, oh, you heard about the child that died, that was my cousin. And her face was just like, okay, what do you want to do? How can I help you? How can I? And it wasn't this pity. It was like very action oriented. And her response to what do you tell a 7-year-old? And to that, I guess I leaned out towards my teachers, right? Towards the other grownups in my life that weren't part of my nuclear family, who were trying to put the pieces together of what had just occurred. But in the same regard, family is for my family, and I've seen it quite a bit for our culture, is a very strong part of who we are. And I'm not just talking about my parents, it's my parents' siblings and all of my cousins. When I say that we spent every holiday, every weekend, every day off from school together like we did, it was ruckus everywhere. I mean, we're all very close in age. So, and another way, it was also relying on support for one another, and two, hearing the things that I know now aren't helpful when people, the adults in my life, saying, you need to be strong for your younger cousins because you're one of the oldest. And in the same time, seeing my grandmother, who had just experienced the death of her grandchild, who she helped raise, never cry, not once. Why? Because she was trying to be strong as a matriarch for everyone else. And just this concept of we are being strong, like, in the same regard, we are being strong for one another. We are leaning on our one leg together. And everyone's trying to show up for each other. Like at no point did it feel like, even my aunt, who had experienced the death of her child, as she is broken down and going through the world's unimaginable pain, is still showing up for our birthdays and still being there with the birthday cake and still putting her face forward. And she's shared this with me now of being strong for her child. So there's this concept of like, I need to be strong for everybody else in my life. And everyone's just trying to be strong for one another. However healthy or unhealthy that is, that's what we did. And at that time, and looking back on it now, like, I wish there was a time for me to be able to process and actually explore those emotions. Absolutely. Especially given what I know now. but I think in the same regard, it's when those moments come up in my life, or when previously, when I was much older and reprocessing the death and exploring it through a new lens, that I was able to understand, I guess, the emotional range that I had at that point. Because what would have then been mad, sad, or glad became frustrated, numb, annoyed, broken, whatever it is in that regard. And I think that just that lends itself to it in one way or another. But I definitely think that in 96, had we had an ability of external support where each one of us would be able to process our own grief journey and not have to be strong for whatever that time period was, I mean, in one way or another, I think it would have been helpful. But I also think that this event, the death of my cousin, made our family stronger, or stronger in the sense of the closeness that occurred, that it bore out. And not every family is fortunate in that regard either. Death can either bring you apart or bring you together. And so for us, it just really solidified the bonds of family. In that sense.
That's really powerful, and a neat insight, because I think in my own world I saw the crumbling of a family when a grief event came through, and it's so different to hear about a shared grief event being like, this is more glue. For as shitty as it is that this is the glue that we're all using to stick together in this, it's like, this is something that continues to ground us and bind us and keep us together. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's kind of like what we were speaking about earlier, where it's hard to imagine anything different. And so you're like, these resources to have in 1996 to be able to lean out into community resources or something like what you do at Bo's Place. And also because we only had the grief coping mechanisms that we did, this is how we turned out, mm-hmm. for better, for worse. Yeah. Really seeing some parallels there. So how did you get from that grief experience in 1996 and kind of seeing what you did with your family to trying on all these new lenses and then eventually landing at Bo's Place and serving people in the Spanish community? Yeah,
I will say I found recently, so I, by training, am a clinical social worker now. And recently I was taking a course on trauma, essentially working with people who have experienced some sort of trauma. And we were discussing trauma responses, and one of them being overachievement. And that it hit the nail on the head for me. My response to my grief, my response to this, my cousin and my aunt's death was overachievement and just really devoting myself to studies. So my entire, I guess, academic career, it was very much focused on, I need to excel in this format. And it came naturally. So that helped for most of the part. And then when I went to college, I was so determined to be a pediatrician because I was going to help people, as I think the majority of folks are like, yeah, I'm going to be a doctor. And then I took organic chemistry, and I was like, no, I'm not going to be a doctor. That's not fun.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, I was like, no. And at the same time, I was taking an elective on family relationships, and I was like, this is fascinating. Organic chemistry is not. So I started exploring what human development and family sciences was, and fell in love with the profession itself. And within one of my courses, it's such a weird way how things come full circle. There was a speaker that came to talk to us about potential jobs after college. And they flat out said, if you want to be guaranteed a job, become a social worker. And I was like, oh, okay, that sounds reasonable. I want a job, as most 20-year-olds do when they're in college. And so I started looking at graduate programs, and came back home to Houston for grad school. And in grad school, I was on this whole, I'm going to be a medical social worker. I'm going to work in the medical center here. I'm going to help people in that regard. Still kind of tying back to my dreams of being a doctor. so I need to get comfortable with grief because that's part of what happens when you go to the hospital. People die sometimes. And so I took a grief and bereavement class with an incredible professor of mine who became my mentor. And as part of her class requirements, we had to go to Bo's Place. So as a graduate student, I went to Bo's Place. I learned about children's grief, and I was like, this is an awesome place, and it's completely free of charge. That's incredible. So I kept it in my bank as a social worker. Following grad school, I started working in one of the hospitals in the medical center, and it was great. I was working in the neuro ICU and neurosurgery floor. I was doing many end-of-life discussions, and I realized that I was craving more of figuring out what happened once people discharge or once the families left, that I had spent weeks, months working with to get to this point of saying goodbye to their person, and then they died and then they would leave. And so just trying to figure out what did that mean. And my very good friend had started working at Bo's Place and sent me a job description of what seemed to be the perfect fit. And by what I consider a miracle in one way or another, Bo's Place said, absolutely, we want you. And that's kind of how that came full circle in that regard. And so I joined Bo's Place in 2015, starting the Spanish programs were starting off, and we, together with my good friend, whom Bo's Place at the time did not know that we were really good friends, and it just great creative energy worked. We were able to exponentially grow the program. And in 5 years, I believe it's like our program grew by, I'll have to fact check this, but I think it's like 425% in 5 years. It grew, and it just, I marvel now at the growth of our programs. But really knowing that there's a need that's present, and I've always believed if we offer it with intentionality, people will come, because that's always a fear in when creating new programming is this what the community needs, and will they access what we're offering? Mm-hmm. And I always went back to, if we're offering it with intentionality and it is a need that we've identified, the puzzle will fit, and people will start to come, and we have to get buy-in from the community. So much outreach occurred over the last couple of years, trying to get the community's buy-in to also show that we're consistent and we're present and we are committed to this. And so, I mean, COVID has kind of also brought to light a number of just facets of what this work brings, because our entire model is based off peer support, right? And we're used to doing this in person. And so having to quickly transition to online and what that brings, and learning how to lead groups online has been a challenge, but also it's this ever working, evolving creation, I guess, for lack of a better word in that regard, of trying to meet the needs of our community. When what we know that helps or assists and supports the grief journey itself is being able to be supported by people when we have implementations, which we so need, of physical distancing and not being able to see people. It's bringing to light a different element of grief in and of itself. And what I'm hearing, what we've heard quite a bit, is folks who were further along in their grief journey are calling us and saying, I thought I was okay, but COVID has made me realize how not okay I am. And just trying to learn about that and navigate that and see how we can continue to support and through the virtual world, which brings its own challenges.
Yeah, totally, because there is a grief in not being able to grieve physically together. Mm-hmm. And that's something that COVID is definitely bringing to light. And it's been interesting for the work that I do, because much of it already exists online. And so for me, it's a lot of business as usual, but I can't tell you how many people I'm hearing in my communities, podcast listeners emailing in being like, my grief support group had to shut down or is discontinued because the space is no longer safe, or we can't meet in person, or I have to travel to the next county over and they're doing social distancing and I don't know if it's worth it. And so to restructure all of that around COVID's been incredibly hard for people too. I want to touch on something. You were saying that, we kind of test in the community, or if we listen well enough, people will tell us the kind of support that they need. And so Spanish speaking programming for grief support kind of bloomed out of that to a huge increase. And I guess my biggest question, especially with your story earlier about the storytelling of having to be strong for your younger relatives or so that the family will know you're okay. How do you reconcile this familial story of be strong with this place is available to you for support without that storytelling looking like one is strong and one is weak and there's a false choice between the two?
Yeah. I'll say one of my, what I will consider profound moments is when we tell people, when you come to group, right? Our groups, like actual group that you'll be in the setting, in the sitting, being able to share your story or support others is about an hour and 15 minutes. And so what I will tell the grownups that I'm talking to, usually the parents or the legal guardians of the kids, is this is your hour and 15 minutes that you don't have to be Superman or Superwoman, right? Because you have had to take on everything around you and be everything and anything to your child, or in the same regard to your spouse. And here's your hour and 15 minutes that you don't have to do that. We have your kids, they're doing their grief work. Your spouse is doing their grief work if that's the case. But here's your time where it's to focus on you. And when I have phrased it in that way, when we have talked about it in a way that this is your individual grief journey, though grief is universal and we all, like as a collective family, are experiencing this grief, each and every single person of the family had a unique relationship with the person who died and brings their own style of coping, brings their own personality to this journey. So we take all that to say you have a space for you yourself to be with others who understand to some degree what it is that you're experiencing. So we'll try to put moms who've all experienced the death of a child in a group together, and women who've all experienced the death of their spouse in a group together. And if we're lucky, we can split out our men's group. If not, if the numbers don't warrant it, then we'll have the men together. Because there's also a gender expectation for how grief is managed, especially, and I can speak to the Latino or Latinx community, because it's who I work with and what I see, but there's a gender norm of how you're supposed to be grieving. And so being able to put the men together, it will be one of the most powerful groups, because this is the one time I don't have to be quote unquote strong. It's the one time I can show my emotion and not be judged about my manlyhood or how much I'm able to provide for my family by being able to be here and do that. So that's the take that we've taken with the community and trying to get their buy-in of like, this isn't a weak versus strong. This is a time for you to be able to process what you're going through. What's also been helpful, and one of the other areas, is that we serve the entire family, right? To some degree, the youngest age that we work with is 5. So most often than not, we'll get the parents in by serving their children. So parents will 99% of the time say, I'm here because of my children. Okay, great. So while your kids are here, we also have support for you. And when it's a couple who have experienced the death of a child and they're coming with children, we'll have mom who will say, I'm coming here to support my children because of my kids. And then we'll have dad or the spouse say, I'm here to support my spouse. So everyone's there to support somebody else. And then the kids will in turn say, we're here because our parents, they need it. So it's in the same way where everyone's trying to take care of one another, because we're able to serve the entire family as is. Everyone's getting the support that they need, and in turn supporting their other families by being there. So it's this like loop almost of how we're being able to support the family individually and as a unit, and everyone's doing it for each other while still processing their own grief.
Yeah, it's almost like a trickery of symbiosis. Yeah. It's like, if I can make you think that you're here to support somebody else, but then you're actually getting help for yourself, but then that looks like supporting somebody else. Kind of this whole thing of like, if I can tell you that story, will secretly actually help you work on your own grief too. And there's no malice or deception or anything behind it. But it's funny. It's like, I'm coming with this intention, and then you're actually getting your intention and another result as well. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost like self-care or self-maintenance in the grief space is like the bonus in addition to taking care of somebody else. And I'm wondering too, like how closely tied to the Latino community is that sense of, I'm not allowed to be selfish, but if I'm doing something in service of taking care of other people, namely my family, then I'll totally sign up.
Absolutely. It hit the nail on the head. One of the cultural values, as is present throughout other cultures as well, but what we see within the Latino community is this value of pride, right? And this pride, I can take care of my family. That's also met with humility that says, if this will help my family, we'll do it. Whatever it takes to be able to help my family, we'll do it, because I, in my pride, am responsible for taking care of my family. So it's this paradigm of what we tend to associate as complete opposites work within itself to be able to lean into the support that's being given or offered in one way or another. So, but it's very much at the core. If I can do something for someone else, almost as a servant leadership, right? If I will sacrifice my time to take my kids to be able to receive the support, then I too am being the leader of the family. Like, this is what we need in that regard. So, it's, as you were talking about that piece, I just hit the nail on the head for me of how so many interactions I've had of family saying, like, we are doing this for everyone here. And it turns into everyone trying to help each other. Like, I'll have 5-year-olds that will be like, my mommy cries all the time, so we're here because my mommy's crying all the time. Or my brother's not doing okay, so that's why we're here. So everything is for someone else in the family. But and the bonus is that they get to process their own grief journey and learn coping skills that will help when their grief resurfaces. Or I won't say resurfaces, when children are able to process their grief at a different developmental stage. So the grief is there. It's just processed through a new lens because they have a new way of seeing the world at that time.
Yeah. And I wonder, this is very different from the kind of grief support that's touted in like the white westernized space of like, you can individually get grief support for yourself. And doesn't really, I mean, there are spaces that take into account like grief as a family, especially children's grief centers. But for the most part, it's like you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, get your own grief support, find grief work that resonates with you, like very like this kind of messaging. So it's fascinating, and it's really, the word I want to use is like heartwarming too, is to see like, this is the way you found the doorway in. With the Latino community too, is I'm going to phrase it in a way where if I'm doing something for someone else, I'm totally signing up because this aligns with my values, my culture, how I see myself and my family, and this kind of larger picture of what it means to be a leader in a family. I'm wondering if there's any stereotypes or misconceptions about the ways that Latino people grieve that you'd like to dispel. Because I think, especially in the United States, we tend to put Latino people into a box. And so what we know about grief is like Day of the Dead and then nothing else. And in some respects, it's like, okay, we know something. But in other respects, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to know. There's so much depth and ancestry and culture here that gets missed in between the orange flowers and the music.
Yeah. Well, I will say though, Coco, I feel like Pixar heard my pleas and cries of how do we at least get the concept of Dia de los Muertos out to the world, and then Pixar came out with Coco, which is it's such a beautiful story of this holiday that ties so well in with grief work, but to that extent, what's been really interesting has been trying to kind of push the envelope, or not push the envelope, but further the conversation that Day of the Dead or Dia de los Muertos, as it's portrayed in Coco, is only celebrated in that way in a very small region, a very small town of Mexico. If you go anywhere else throughout Latin America, November 1st, which is Day of the Dead or Dia de los Muertos or All Saints Day, or I think All Saints Day may be it looks completely different throughout Latin America. And generally there is this remembering of the people who have died, of your family, but without the orange flowers and the mariachis and the papel picado or the altars and the ofrendas, each culture honors their person in a different way. But to that extent, I will say too, I mean, I am the first to say I absolutely love Dia de los Muertos personally, but that has to be with my work. One of the misconceptions, I believe, and I've heard this often, where I'm told, Latinos are very passionate. There's grief. And I've talked about this in some of my previous talks of just the pride for our country, the pride for where you're from is really felt within the culture. But in the same regard, the feeling of not being able to express, or there being a time limit, right? Within at least some of the countries and their cultures of Latin America, will see there's an expected time frame of how long you're allowed to grieve, how long you're allowed to be sad. And it's usually 1 year. Anything further than a year, you've lost it, you have, for lack of a better term, you've gone crazy, you've lost your mind. How can you still be sad? It's been a year. There are these grief expectations that exist that are currently, we're trying to dismantle by saying, yeah, it's a year, but did you only know them for a year? Like, right? And that you grieve to the extent that you loved, and is your love measured in that time? And so to some extent, dismantling these expectations for reactions, right? Not all Latinos are going to cry passionately. Not all Latinos are going to wail. And I think there's those expectations that Latinos are very explosive or expressive in their emotions, and that doesn't always occur. But then within Latinos, for us, it's this expectation of time, and what's considered acceptable by society for how long you can wear black to show to the world that you are still mourning, and how long it's okay for you not to go to parties if that's the case, or to hear music, or to celebrate in one way or another. There are some cultures that within Latin America that get that specific, where it's like, it's been 6 months. Sure, you can go to a birthday party, but before that, you're disrespecting the person who died. And so dismantling time expectations on one hand within Latinos, and then I think to your original question of the U.S. and just the perception, Latino grief goes beyond just Dia de los Muertos, although great holiday. Totally encourage everyone to watch Coco if you haven't already. But within that, the expressiveness of emotions isn't always the case with everyone, and it is this misconception that that's what you're going to give. I'll say one of the things we at Bo's Place have been, I think, privileged to witness is this immense gratitude that our Spanish-speaking families have for the services that we provide. And so it's not just like, oh, thank you so much because this is free. It's I think you hit the nail on the head. I think in the Western world, right, we can absolutely, I know this as being born in the US too, like I just go on Google and say, find therapist near me or find anything near me, right? Like Yelp exists for a reason. We can review, and we know that that's a service that exists. And oftentimes with our Spanish speaking communities, there isn't this awareness or assumption that that's available and that it's going to be available in the language that I speak. And so being able to offer services in the language of that is common and comfortable, but ultimately the language of their heart that transcends emotion in that regard, we encapsulate or really their opportunity. I won't say their opportunity, but we encapsulate this movement of just gratitude. And so we've talked about it quite a bit at Bo's Place because my colleagues who aren't Latino or Latinx will, Mark, like, you want to read some of the most beautiful quotes about our services, go to our Spanish-speaking families, because they will write poems and dissertations about just what this means to them in ways that our English-speaking families just don't. And it's not, and I think part of it is language. Like, there's a benefit of your language being a romance language, I think. When it comes to being able to express
English is not sexy.
no, but being able to just to put that into words, it like absolutely, it always makes me chuckle when our grants manager will ask, like, hey, do you have any good quotes that I can use for some of our grant requests? And I'll say, yeah, let me pull some up, and they're like paragraphs. I mean, like, legitimately 3 to 4 sentence paragraphs, and they're all about like what grief support and what we've been able to offer has meant to them in their life. And we usually stay back and we're like, wow, it's beautiful. And I could never, I guess, it never gets old to read, and the words of gratitude, which I will gladly sit there and read for hours, but just to see what it means to someone to be able to offer something in the language that they understand and they speak, and to do it with great intentionality, that it doesn't just utilize Google Translate to translate our materials and then say, here you go, here's what we got off of Google, because I know that happens in some areas because of funding, right? It's hard to get services funded sometimes, but there has to be this commitment and this intentionality to working with this community, and to do it thoughtfully. I think it's felt, and we all know that, right? If you intentionally go work on a project, you're going to have a better product and outcome than if you just very quickly try to do something on the whim with limited resources.
Yeah. I literally just wrote down, this is how much we care about the state of your heart. Mm-hmm. And so when you speak about intentionality, and at first I was like, intention can be a dicey word of like, what did you mean to do when you set out to do this, and how the people who are receiving it actually absorb it and process it. But I think as I'm understanding it, it's like we did this on purpose because it matters, because we've seen the results, and because we've heard the cry of how great of a need that this is. And so the converse of that is like you get these enormously grateful, like, thank you notes, and like, holy cow, I didn't realize how much this was needed or how it was going to change my life. And I think you're right that it would absolutely come through in a different way. than people who speak English, because there's English grief support everywhere. And the internet is full of it. And there are grief support centers who, put all their things through Google Translate. And it's like, here you go. It's something in Spanish, but to do it on purpose and to do it well and to have it, funded and resourced and large enough to take care of the family as a unit. It's like, we mean it. And that can be felt. I think that is something that translates very highly across languages. It's like, we did this and we mean it. Yeah. Absolutely. And I know we're getting to the end of our time, Cristina, so I wonder if you can tell us where we can find out more about you and your work, and as well as if people want to get in touch with Beau's Place or any other Spanish resources you'd like to recommend too.
Yeah, of course. So your listeners can definitely, I said Google, but can go to www.beausplace.org. We're also on Instagram and Facebook. And there, what's really neat about our website is that you literally click on I believe it's ESP, and our entire website's translated, not through Google Translate, but it's translated. And everything that we have in English, we've intentionally attempted to offer it in Spanish. There are some parts that haven't been because we don't offer it yet, but there are tons of resources on our website and our resource library, parent handouts, both in English and Spanish, recommended readings for folks who are looking to either support someone who's grieving or who are grieving themselves and just looking for what are the words. So I would encourage that route. And then for those not in Texas or looking for additional support, I'm also a board member for the National Alliance of Grieving Children. So through childrengrieve.org, you can find local support in your community. They have a really great interactive map that allows you to see just what grief support centers and members of the National Alliance of Grieving Children are in each state and broken down by cities from there. And so that's childrengrieve.org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cristina, for joining us on Coming Back today. I think this is so important to even know that these conversations are happening in Spanish, and then to elevate them too, in the hopes that we have more of them. Yeah, super important. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So that's all for this episode of Coming Back. Thank you so very much to Cristina Cipriano for coming back to talk about the importance of grief support in the language of the heart, and why it's so important to support not only the grieving individual, but the family as a whole. Cristina came back by examining what it means to be strong for others in grief, and by leaning on her teachers and other trusted confidants. You can find out more about Spanish language grief support at Beau's Place in the show notes, and there are links there to the Spanish and English websites both. Be sure to pre-order my new book, Your Grief, Your Way, 366 Days of Comfort and Practical Exercises After the Death of a Loved One now, wherever you buy books. For the link to purchase, as well as your invitation to an exclusive book launch party on September 29th, click the link in the show notes. And be sure to stay tuned after the credits for an excerpt from the book. If you'd like to get online grief support for just $3 a month, pledge to support this podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. You will instantly unlock access to weekly grief guidance prompts and monthly calls with me. And our next call is coming up on Monday, October 26th at 5 p.m. Pacific Time. If you like what you heard today, you know I'm going to say it. Subscribe to Coming Back on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and please tell a friend about Coming Back, because you never know what someone you love is going through. Thank you so much to Addie Goldstein, who composed our theme music. You can find me at Facebook at Shelby Forsythia Intuitive Grief Guide, Instagram at Grief Guide Shelby Forsythia, or simply shelbyforsythia.com. If you'd like to leave a question or comment for a future show, email me at shelby@shelbyforsythia.com. As always, my dear grief growers, it was beautiful sharing this space and time with you today. I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world, and I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of Coming Back. Now, check out the September 23rd entry from my new daily grief book, Your Grief, Your Way. September 23rd. Death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it. Haruki Murakami. Especially in westernized society, there's a toxic narrative that equates death with failure, punishment, and negativity. Death equals bad, life equals good. We frame death as a failure to win against a disease or diagnosis. We punish wrongdoers with the death penalty, and we sell and market ways to prolong life via workouts, diet plans, and medications. However, death is woven into life, just like birth is woven into life. When we fold death into the experience of life, instead of making it life's adversary, we are able to see it as a normal experience that happens, instead of an awful nightmare that is brought upon us by some malevolent force. Death is not a failure to live. It is a natural occurrence knitted into every single one of our lives. If this entry resonated with you in your grief, pre-order Your Grief Your Way now wherever you buy books. For more information, including your invitation to an exclusive book launch party on September 29th, visit shelbyforsythia.com. I'll see you next week on Coming Back.